Hey, so good afternoon. We are here, the ATAC Center, otherwise known as ATAC, from Disability Rights New Jersey. My name is Jessie. I work with Mike and Naomi, for those of you who don't know me yet. And today we are discussing all things accessibility with our friend Jason Curtin. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand the mic over to him and we'll get started.
Hey, thank you so much, Jesse. I'm going to share my screen. One second. One, share sound, share. All right. So first, thank you to Mike, Naomi, and Jesse, sorry, for inviting me here today to speak to you guys about accessibility. My name is Jason. I work for the Office of IT Accessibility, and my role here is to make sure that all of our digital assets are accessible, which includes but not limited to our websites, the software we purchase, develop, and maintain, course content, social media, etc. I'd like to believe that people are inherently, that they know that they shouldn't discriminate against people with disabilities. And I like to believe they understand that when they don't make their content accessible, that they know students in their class are then not going to be able to access it. I think what we really are talking about is a struggle in priorities. I think we are constantly trying to sell this idea of prioritize later, meaning, you work really hard now, so you don't have to work hard later. You save money now, so you don't have to worry about it later. You exercise now so that, you're not going to be in pain later. And I think the reason why it's so hard to convince people to prioritize later or to put working now, on making your docs and websites accessible so that later someone down the line with a disability can access it is that we really never know what tomorrow looks like. We're so stuck in all of the challenges of today. And Adam Savage, he did this talk about art and science, and he said that culture is a conversation that we are having. And art and science is the way we have that conversation. So here at Rutgers, we're really trying to shift our culture by making accessibility part of the conversations that we are having. And so today's presentation really is about how do we do that. And I'm not a Chinese cultural expert, but in China, there are these adult playgrounds, right? They're specifically designed for senior citizens. And as early as grade school, you've probably seen the TikTok and Instagram short clips where you have teachers, doing exercise with these kids in the middle of class. It isn't a question of should I exercise, it's just part of that culture. And that's what we're trying to do here at Rutgers is to just make accessibility part of what we do every day. It's just part of our culture. It isn't about this idea of I'm doing this for some later benefit. It's just what we do. And so this presentation is meant really to provide you with tools to help drive those conversations. And after we're done here, I'll send all of the videos and the assets that we use here in this presentation. Because my hopes is that you can then be able to use these as part of a toolkit in your conversations moving forward with faculty, staff, whoever it might be, on why we need to be doing this. And so you can start generating conversations, at your own universities. Hold on, I've got to click buttons. So just a little bit disclaimer, this presentation is just my views and my views only. It doesn't represent Rutgers' plan, and it by no means represents any legal advice. I really appreciate ATAC having me on to talk about this very important topic. Um, so on the screen is a line drawing of the Guggenheim Museum, and on the left-hand side, top left has a drawing of just shapes, right? Just basic shapes of that museum in boxes in perspective. And below that, those boxes are then filled in with some general shapes of the building. You can start to see the building starting to form within that rough structure. And the last last picture is the full drawing of the Guggenheim Museum with things shaded in and all the details filled in. And so when we talk about accessibility, everyone is on their own journey. And some people are in that first stage of they're just drawing shapes in perspective. And other people, they may be a little more seasoned that they're drawing general outlines and things start to look more like the object that they are aiming to make. And other people, we may be here, we may be experts, and we may be the ones who are able to make these beautiful line drawings with all the shading and perspective and all the shadows. But it's important to understand that we're all practicing accessibility and we're all in a different stage. There's this YouTube uh, creator, and she does drawings on her channel, and she talks about the importance of getting through the ugly part. That oftentimes we start something and we get really excited because we know something about a thing, right? Like drawing. And then we start to do it and we get to this point that our drawing doesn't look like the thing that we were hoping it to look like, and we stop, right? But it's important that whatever we're doing, we're helping people get through that ugly part. And we're going to talk about this concept a little bit later, but a lot of the people that we're going to run into are people that may know a little bit about something, but then stop because they reached that roadblock where it was like, I tried to make my PowerPoint accessible, or I tried to make my PDF accessible, and it didn't look like what I thought it was supposed to look like. This was too hard, and they gave up. Um, but before we get into that, let's talk about what accessibility is. So on the screen is a picture of the Washington Monument in the background. In the foreground, there's a group of diverse people all walking towards it. And really, this is what accessibility is. In the background, there are laws like the ADA. There's a lot of laws that pertain to equal rights and anti-discrimination that basically define that we need to treat people with disabilities in the same way that we wouldn't, discriminate on the basis of sex or gender or whatnot. But in the forefront, this is really about people, right? In the forefront of all this is really about a diverse group of people, all with diverse abilities, all utilizing different tools to be able to access that same content and wanting to do so in the same means and manner as everyone else. And so we're going to take some time today to listen to those stories.
Yeah, so I've been working in the accessibility industry for maybe about a decade now, I think. Um, I found my way into accessibility as a career kind of by accident. I'd been like working my way through various publishing roles in sales, in editorial, and I started to get these customer questions coming my way that I didn't know how to answer. And I am kind of a know-it-all, and I really love being right. So when I didn't always have answers like immediately available to me for the questions that were being asked, um, I started to seek them from external sources and ask questions the people around me outside of my organization. And what's really interesting to me is that as I started doing this accessibility work, I got really deeply involved, and I did it for a really long time, or have been doing it for a long time. At least it feels that way to me. Um, but it took a long time before I was able to acknowledge that I'm a member of the disability community. Like, I live with chronic illness, I live with chronic pain, I have PTSD and related anxiety. And at one point, I was walking with a cane, and somebody asked me directly what my disability is. And I responded that I wasn't disabled. Uh, and it was like that point in the journey where I'd been working in accessibility for a few years, and I had some knowledge under my belt and some experience, and I realized that I had a really significant amount of internalized ableism that I was completely unprepared for, and I knew that I needed to tackle, that I needed to address. I knew that I wanted to help people and I knew that accessibility mattered. But it took so much work before I was okay with it mattering to me personally. And that for me was the moment that I feel like I sort of turned around in the work that I was doing and really started digging very deep. And I feel like my work became more fulfilling and also more helpful to other people when I was able to move into that part of my journey.
Um, So let's shift gears. I don't know if that you and I have talked too much about this up to this point, but can you talk to us about, what got you thinking that, you should get tested, and what got think you thinking into like, you may have something that you want to go get tested for, and what was that process like?
For me, it wasn't like a singular moment. It was kind of, I don't know, it reminds me of a snowstorm in a little bit where like, it's fine, it's flurrying. I have time to drive home, it'll be great. And then all of a sudden there's more snow, and then the next thing you know, the roads are a mess. And it felt very similarly. I had a colleague, actually a colleague at Rutgers, someone who was there just before me, who we both know, who had ADHD. And we were talking about what that experience was like for her because, we were just making small talk, water cooler chit chat like you do with your coworkers. And she pointed out to me, she was like, "Do you realize that you kind of hyper focus on things? Like, there are times where I catch you and you're so focused on something and, you haven't gotten up to stretch, you haven't gotten up to get water, like you are super focused like a laser on something." And I was like, "Oh, haha, that's really funny. No, I hadn't noticed that. I guess I've just, when I get into like a flow state, I get into a flow state. That's it, right? That's no big deal." Um, and then I started digging a little more because I wanted to learn more about ADHD because it was a condition she had. And, I like to be curious and to learn more about the people around me because my world experience cannot be the only thing that informs my perspective, that informs the way that I move through the world. It's really important to learn about how other people exist in the world, especially if you are building something or designing something, because you need to account for those different experiences and perspectives. So I really wanted to learn more about ADHD while I knew this person, and I had this awesome resource who was okay with me asking questions about what her experiences were like. So I started reading, and the thing that was kind of a watershed for me was learning about auditory processing issues. So it's very common for folks who have ADHD to have an auditory processing struggle. And what that feels like, what you may recognize this in yourself if you also have auditory processing issues, are things like someone might ask you a question and you'll go, "What?" or "Huh?" And then you'll be able to answer the question before the other person has time to re-ask it. It's almost like your brain just needs like an extra 1 or 2 seconds to kind of process things. Or if you're someone who prefers having captions on all the time, even though your hearing is fine, you may have some struggles with auditory processing. I know that that was definitely the case for me. I really struggled when I was a kid because my mom would yell at me for not listening and not paying attention. Um, when I would have issues like that, where she would tell me to do something, or she would ask me a question, and I would have to say, "Huh?" And then I would be able to answer her again before she could repeat the question. So that was kind of the watershed moment where I was like, "Oh, hey, maybe there is something about this." And so, of course, the more I started digging, the more I learned, the more I started to see those signs of things in myself. And I was pretty sure I had ADHD. And when I went to go get an assessment to kind of figure out where I was, it honestly just felt validating, right? Like, oh, this thing that you do think you have actually is something that you have. And I had a similar experience with my most recent diagnosis of diabetes, but that runs in my family. So that one was a little bit less of a surprise, whereas ADHD is not something that has been heavily diagnosed in my family, although it does also have a hereditary component.
Make sure you hit record.
I heard recording in progress.
Oh, did you? Oh, good. So
Yeah.
now we're recording. Hold on. Yep, I'm gonna play some music that only I'll hear. We are joined with us in the interview room today with Marie Clapeau. Did I say that right? Is that how you pronounce your
You
last name?
did. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
perfect, perfect. So let's start by having you tell us a little bit about you and what led you into your work in accessibility.
Okay. I'm going to do the long story short. I think there's a personal connection. I'm myself a person with disability, and years ago I was studying um, management of cultural heritage, and I ended up doing an internship in the US. And I had I was lucky enough to have one of those haha moments. I was interning at a museum in San Francisco, and the access coordinator at the time there, Tish Brown, offered me to come to a workshop with blind people, and I'm myself legally blind. And I said, yes, why not? And let's do it. I was actually interning in a very different department. I was in the volunteer office. And I went over there, and it just it just clicked for me. And I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. And ever since I found ways to train myself and ended up in the US. And so what has animated my practice for long is, who is not coming to the museum. I think what I realized over time as I've started doing the work is that I had myself not been able to access or not have experiences like I would have liked. It's funny how memory works, but like I recall being 8 years old and going with my parents to visit some like historic sites, and there was a small museum there. And my dad is blind, and we have a genetic disease running in the family. And I specifically remember like calling on him and saying, there's something really cool in that case. And of course, from an 8-year-old perspective, I didn't connect the dots at the time. But later on, I realized that he said no. He said like, I know what you're talking about, etc. Which, of course, he did not. And what I realized, he didn't come with me because he could not see. It was a dark space. He could not access the content. So how could he interact with me? And so I kind of held that memory with me, and obviously also connecting to a wide diversity of people with disabilities. People have their own stories, or also clearly cannot access content in museums. So the question has been always for me, like, who is not coming to the museum and why? And so I spent nearly 10 years in the accessibility office at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where we are more focused on looking at inclusive programming and institutional change. And then I recently started a position with Tactile Studio, which is a global inclusive design agency. And so we specialize more in inclusive and accessible solution and in shifting the built environment. And so I'm interested in that shift in accessible design and how to shift the built environment as a way to promote more autonomy for visitors. Because with programs, like, people have that option to come to the museum, but depending on how you approach programmatic change in the museum, it can be difficult for people to come in the other ways. That's kind of how I got to accessible design, and I'm excited to think of how actually we can have a built environment can be shifted, and that can be in small ways. That can be through like actual installation to make the content of a museum, of a cultural institution, more accessible.
She went on to talk about like learning through the senses of like taste and smell. That was a really fascinating conversation. Just 3 more.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're spot on. Another anecdote that I'll share just to that point is, as they were giving me all of these tactile and audio only options, I think I was in about 5th grade. I said, hey, will you teach me Braille? Like, I could read with my eyes, but I wanted to learn Braille. And it seemed to be like the kind of stuff they wanted to give me. So I was like, hey, will you teach me Braille? And my TVI looked at me and said, no, we're not going to expend the time, energy, or resources to teach you Braille. Your vision is too good. She said, if you were to go blind, you would be the first one I'd want to teach Braille, but you don't need to know Braille. And I was like, okay, well, but I also am telling you that I don't want these audio options. So I'm kind of stuck here a little bit. And so, I think your point is very valid, and it's something that I talk about a lot, is that low vision and blindness are significantly different. So much so that I really believe they should almost be categorized as different disabilities. And that's not to say that one is more difficult than the other. It's not to say that one is more deserving of accommodations than the other. It's just that the accommodations and the lived experience of somebody with low vision is going to be very different than the accommodation needs of someone who is totally blind or very near totally blind. The things that have been put in place to support individuals who are blind in terms of accessibility options, again, those tactile and those audio only pieces, are really not helpful to those of us who have low vision. We just need things to be a little bit more viewable, a little bit larger, a little bit higher contrast. Um, and what ends up happening that I experienced personally, and that many, many people that I have spoken to through the work that I do have shared, is that this leaves people who have low vision feeling like they are not disabled enough um, to receive support of any kind. And it also has them feeling like they are like they shouldn't be asking for help or can't ask for help. And as a result of that, oftentimes we learn to just figure it out on our own, which in a number of ways is good. There's some self-sufficiency there. But what I have found also in the work that I have done is that this leads to this negative feedback spiral where people with low vision just kind of go it alone. And so people who would be providing accommodations to people with low vision are like, we don't have anybody with low vision in our circle. We never hear from them. And so they don't provide resources. And then on the rare occasion somebody with low vision goes to ask for resources, they're not there. And then they assume that there will never be resources for them. And it's just this really difficult cycle for everybody. Now, so the work that Roboca is doing now is that we actually have taken our vision, our technology that helps make the most of existing vision. And we're working with organizations like museums and libraries and conferences to make Roboca available for free to individuals while they're in those spaces. And the conversation that I have a lot as we're talking to these organizations is they're confused. They're like, how can there be this many people with low vision? We never hear from them. And, the answer that I have to and have had to learn how to kind of gently give is, these people are out there. We are the vast majority of people with low vision. Vision impairment is one of the largest disability categories internationally. The problem is that because there are no accessibility options for them, they just figure that they have to go it alone, or they don't come to these spaces. They don't go to the museum. They don't go to the Performing Arts Center because they just know that they won't be able to access it and then there's nothing that they can do. And so there really is this like devastating cycle that has to be broken in order for us to better support people with low vision in all spaces, because it's better for everybody if somebody with low vision can come and enjoy the museum. That museum is getting more patronage. Their mission of whatever they're trying to teach is getting further expanded. And for someone like me, we're getting the opportunity to experience those things and share it, not just share it with our families, whether that be older generations or younger. And so I think really everybody benefits when we start to realize that this really enormous vision impairment population exists and they deserve to be supported, even if they're not coming out of the woodwork themselves right now.
Let's shift gears and talk about some of the experiences you've heard from students, either about the struggles they are facing in the classroom or the struggles with the environment or people here at Rutgers.
Ooh, okay. So that bit I mentioned earlier about having a lot of friends who experience these things, teaching me self-love, I've experienced that like at an exponential rate just from meeting with students. Every student is so different, and their symptoms, I feel like, from the way they talk about them, come from completely different things than the next student. Like sometimes it's like an older generation person coming back to school, and they're just adjusting to like the new norms or the new expectations of like computer literacy. Other times it's someone having a very like troubling home environment that I probably should not be hearing when I meet with a student. But at the same time, it's like, I think when you're in this position of seeking help, I know we talked about that forced vulnerability. I think it's like, depending on the things I say or depending on the things I ask them about, their mind just goes in a direction of like, well, I'm experiencing this and it's kind of involved with this thing that's going on in my personal life. In terms of how these students kind of like inform me of this understanding of neurodivergence, I feel as you said before, like this generation is more, I guess, reactive
Hmm.
to the societal pressures that are onto us. From meeting with these students, I'm kind of like, yeah, who cares if I don't make eye contact, or who cares if I don't have my camera on, or who cares if I'm like not fully attentive during this meeting? Like I didn't have breakfast yet. Like I wouldn't want my student to go through this, so I'm gonna get up and get a glass of water.
Yeah.
So in a very like funny way, a lot of my students have made me so reactive to myself that I become more of a functioning person, and my experience of life is just like my quality of life has just like shot up. But at the same time, because those things happened, I'm kind of like, am I still neurodivergent?
Oh.
Yeah. And it makes me revisit that idea of like, oh, maybe did I overdiagnose myself, or did people overdiagnose me? Maybe I'm just a person going under certain conditions or certain pressures that make my mind function in a way that is incompatible to those pressures. But in terms of the students, like I there has been this conversation of like, oh, there's a lot of the diagnosis for like depression or for anxiety has like gone so much up since the pandemic. Well, I guess in a way the pandemic is still going on, but during that time where we were mostly quarantining, that I feel like I'm kind of in this headspace where like I'm kind of inclusive of quote unquote situational disabilities.
Last one. Wow. Now, in your experience going through that school or other schooling, have you used assistive technology or any accommodations?
So for fire and EMT, the beginning of classes, I didn't use anything. I just sort of got to it was a kind of a point of silly pride, but really every deaf firefighter I met, they told me that they were proud to go through school without any accommodations. So I felt as though, wow, I have to match their energy and really push through. But looking back, I kind of do wish that I had an interpreter sitting with me. I do understand the basics and I understood how to manage a situation around the context around it. But there were some sorts of in-depth information where they were talking about the history or talking about another story that it was just hard for me to follow through entirely. So I wish I had an interpreter tell me, and so that way I could learn the lore of firefighting is what I missed.
Oh, wow. Okay, we're gonna take some seconds to digest all the things we just heard. I just want to pull out some of those important points. So, first, I think when we think of people with disabilities, we often think of the extremes, right? We think of someone who's blind, someone who can't access your sight because they can't see, someone who's deaf and can't hear your video, someone who can't walk, or someone who can't open the door. But in reality, all disabilities, they fall on a spectrum, right? And that spectrum, it begins with people like Rachel and Desiree, right? And so we learned from Rachel, that she didn't identify as having a disability despite walking with a cane and working with individuals with disabilities every day and hearing stories similar to her, because she had internalized this notion of like she wasn't disabled enough. And we hear that a lot in our community in terms of, I didn't request accommodations because I don't think I'm disabled enough. There was a conference recently by the Q, and don't quote me on the numbers, but the keynote had mentioned a ridiculously high number, something like 60% of, people with disabilities, they don't go and register with the Office of Disability Services because they don't think either they're not disabled enough or they don't need those accommodations. Um, and we heard from Desiree that for her, it felt like a snowstorm where there were some flurries and she's like, oh, she'll be fine. And, now it's starting to sick and, oh, it'll be fine. And now the roads are covered. Oh, I can stay another hour. And all of a sudden she's driving home in this blizzard. And her experience of the world is really just her pushing through day to day. And we're going to get back to this thought of just having to push through it. Um, and then we heard from Rebecca as well of this idea of, she went to these places, they didn't have things that she needed. And so she just decided she needs to figure it out on her own. And there's so many students like that who, they try to get the help they need. They aren't able to, for whatever reason, things don't work, and either they don't show up or they just say I have to figure it out on my own. I have to go alone on my own. Um, and then we heard Marie echo this as well, right? Like she talked about, that missed experience with her dad, and she couldn't really understand why, but it was because he couldn't see the exhibit. And so he kind of brushed it off. And so now when she does her work, she used to work at the Met. Um, what she said is that she looks for groups that are not in the numbers. Because so many times what we hear is, oh, I only have one deaf person who used our services, or we don't have any low vision users who request any items, so I don't think we need to worry about those groups. Because they think those groups don't exist because they hadn't seen them. But in reality, from all these stories that we heard, from all the guests that we had, really is that people want you to know that they exist. And they don't show up because there's nothing there for them. And they've come to this determination that I just have to figure it out on my own or just not show up at all. Um, in Ken's video, we learned that every person is going to experience their disability differently. And how that disability manifests and how it impacts them may vary from hour to hour. And, it may be, in fact, based on their situation. And so disability also isn't this static thing. It's not that you fall within this spectrum and that's where you are. It's going to vary from day to day. Um, and lastly, in the clip with Ethan, who's a deaf firefighter, uh, you know, he talks about, he wants to show up and have the same experience in the same way as everyone else. He doesn't want to have to use accommodations. He doesn't want special treatment. He doesn't want to have to take his firefighter exam differently than other people. He wants to do the same thing in the same way as everyone else. He wants to prove to you that he can do this. So, on the screen, you're going to see uh, a picture of three different types of plants. And one plant to the far left on the windowsill, it looks like, there's some sun burning and, some spots where the plant's not doing so well because it's getting too much sun. In the middle, there's a plant that, it's kind of small and it looks like it's struggling to grow. Maybe it's not getting enough sun. And the last picture is this plant that's thriving. And the takeaway from all this is a couple of things. One, that, we all have the ability to control the environment in which, people exist, right? Through the emails we send out, through the PowerPoints we create for our students, through the websites we create, we have a hand in creating that environment, right? And it isn't just, everyone being able to access the sun, but it's, we want to set up this environment in a way that everyone's able to thrive, right? And we have the ability to do that within our means. Um, you know, I didn't realize how many times I said, shifting gears. I was going to use that just now. But just to shift gears a little bit and talk about something that's a little tangential. So I used to do this thing called Jam Jung. It's like really slow yoga. And basically you'd hold your body in these positions. And as you held your body in this position, you'd usually be standing in front of a mirror and you notice like, oh, I'm leaning a little bit to the left, or oh, I'm a little off-centered, like my left shoulder is up high opposed to something else. And we're going to do a little bit of experiment just in your own seat wherever you are. I just want you to, try to sit up straight. I want you to open up your shoulders, roll your shoulders back and up and back. And I want you to think about as if there's a cord connected to your head that's pulling you upwards, right? That is what good posture looks like. And a lot of us, what we end up doing is because we're sitting in our desk and whatnot, we end up slouching and we end up, doing these things that our body, you know, becomes so used to that it thinks it's the norm, right? Like when you start doing things like jam jam, or you start focusing on some of those more internal arts, you start to notice as you're walking down the street, like, oh yeah, that person, their left hip is a bit higher, and it looks like they're really putting a lot of weight on that right knee, right? Like you start noticing these things, and what ends up happening is we become so used to the pain and we become so used to being out of norm, out of center, that our mind thinks that is the norm. And then we start to put ourselves back into the quote unquote right position. We start to put ourselves back into that healthy position. Our body actually starts to fight it a bit because it's gotten so used to that norm and wants to go back to what's comfortable. And we do this with everything, right? We do this even this presentation, I was putting together the slideshow and I had that title slide and I noticed, this H in, understanding, the importance of accessibility, this letter here, against this yellow background is a bit difficult to read, right? And I'm looking at this and I was like, I don't have a lot of time to do this presentation. And you just keep going. And what we don't realize is, we think about this as there's this student with the disability and there's on the opposite side of that coin, there is a person who's perfectly able, making this world inaccessible. But the truth of the matter is, we all have, a certain degree of inability. No one has perfect human bodies, right? And we are creating environments that are harmful for ourselves. It's just that we have gotten so used to that harm, it becomes what we know, it becomes what we're comfortable with, right? And so the rest of this, presentation is gonna be how do we, I don't want to use the word sell, but how do we sell and make these changes on our campus and how we sell this to other people? But I think the first step is recognizing this isn't about an other. This isn't about, there's some person somewhere down the future that's not going to be accessing, who's not going to be able to access this PowerPoint. Is no, having lots of words on a slide is difficult for me to read, right? Like having all these colors that, don't line up because it doesn't meet color contrast is difficult for me to read. Like I'm creating an environment that I myself, am not able to thrive in. And when we think about our websites and the fact that like, everything is getting smaller on the page, or you look at, Microsoft Outlook now on the web, and I'm sure you use that tool every day. It's got its left sidebar of all the apps that it has, and then it's got your folders, then it's got, the messages, and then your reading pane has become smaller and smaller to accommodate all these things. We need to see more items at once, right? Like we think that's the path forward in terms of being more efficient and productive, but we just keep creating a world that we ourselves are unable to function, and thrive in. Um, so, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, the updates to the Title II, because part of like why accessibility is important and a big driver of, a lot of the work that's happening at Rutgers right now is the recent DOJ updates to Title II. And so, yes, like we need to do this because this is the right thing. There's also this other piece of it that says this is also a legal thing that you have to do. And I'm not going to spend too much time, on this. But what I will say is that the new Title II regulations basically say that all your web and mobile content needs to meet WCAG 2.1 AA compliance. And in a moment, I'm going to give you some resources to learn all about that. If by some reason you haven't heard about this, and just as a broad strokes, that includes all your websites, regardless of if it's on your domain or not, all your social media contents and posts by the university, and there's some exceptions there that you should go look into. All the software you purchase, developed or maintained, right? It doesn't matter how many users, it doesn't matter if it's hosted. If you're using this software at your organization, it needs to be accessible. All the hardware with the user interface, right? And so you think about like your washing machines that you need a mobile app to use. All the mobile apps that your university is creating or maintaining. All the course content, regardless of it being behind an authenticated wall. All your third-party tools, including freeware that a faculty might be using for their course, or LTIs or items purchased outside the university like VoiceThread. All your digital textbooks, all your digital communications like email, all your digital content like live streaming events. This new title, the two regulation basically says, listen, you need like all of it needs to conform to WCAG 2.1 AA compliance, and is given a date in which those covered under the ADA Title II need to comply by, depending on your size. And so for most people, that's going to be April 2026. Um, so when we send this out, you'll have access to these links to click on. But these are basically just overarching summaries of what Title II says. The DOJ did a seminar. They also put out a step-by-step guide of getting started, being compliance. And then You Do It, which is out of Washington University, did a legal, webinar of like, here's what it means legally. Um, Okay, so how do we tell this story? How do we get people to listen and think about accessibility? How do we start to change the culture by changing the story than the conversations we are having? The first is storytelling. There's this book called Great Communicators, and what it did is in it, it talks about this study where they hooked up all these electrodes to people's brains and they measured the brain activity of these musicians who were playing this piece. And what they found was when all the musicians were playing the same piece, all their brain activity lined up perfectly. Like their whole bodies were in sync. And the question they then ask themselves is, okay, like where else does this happen? Where like two human beings, their mental brain charts, or whatever it is called when you do that, where did we find this beyond music? Um, and they found it actually in storytelling. They had this woman who were talking about her experience. She was a domestic violence victim, and she was sharing the story of like what happened. And what they found was that when we tell stories, not only are we like in tune, our brain waves in tune, but then all of our breathing and all of our heart rates, all those other things, as she tells her stories, becomes in tuned with that person. And so you think about like the ultimate form of capturing someone's attention, and that really is, you know, the essence of the power of like storytelling is that we remember more about how we feel and like, the end goal more than like the details of that story. And those stories, they stay with us. Um, so on the screen, there's a quote: Curiosity is the product of a knowledge gap. You need to know a little about something to be curious. You know, the second piece of advice I'm going to give people is don't throw everything at people at once. I think we do this a lot. We basically just send people a list of here's all the ways you need to make your PowerPoint accessible. Here's all I've seen this even here at Rutgers. We have a page for faculty, and it must be like 5 word pages long of every possible scenario that someone thought of that a faculty might need. And what we end up doing is we end up overwhelming them. At the start of the the start of this presentation, we talked about this idea of people are at different places in their journey to practice accessibility. And so you really need to meet people where they're at. And you need to give them it in small doses because you want them to be curious. And you want that curiosity to drive further conversations to create a dialogue, opposed to what tends to happen most often, which is two monologues happening, right? Is you need to do this, and then like the standard response, that you get an email. Um, Next is where you sit is where you stand. Um, Different people are going to have different priorities. And so the conversation you have is really going to be different from person to person. And I'm going to just jump to the next slide. So on these, what I've done is I've given you some websites that I use very often. The first three are sites that basically compile the latest legal cases that are happening. And so it gives you a good overview of here's all the website lawsuits that we've seen. Here's all the recent OCR resolutions we've seen. And with that, you can filter that by type. And so if you just want to see, those related to facilities and access or those related to, university websites, you can filter that down. And the last three is things about costs. And cost tends to be one of those things that people generally don't like sharing. So sometimes you need to make comparisons in terms of like, okay, well, here's what we're seeing in the business realm of people losing, money annually because their content is not accessible. Here's all that lost revenue. And when you think of like the things that really drive a negotiation, really sell a point, is the fear of missing out. It is all of our universities right now are trying to figure out, where the tuition dollars coming from. And here's all these numbers showing, yeah, no, here's all the missed, opportunities, the dollars you could be having. Here's all the students with disabilities who aren't showing up, to your doorstep because things aren't accessible. Um, and the last thing in terms of how to tell the story is, I think we all like mass marketing. We like mass marketing because we can show pretty numbers, right? We show the numbers of, oh, we've reached, 2,000 people in this one email. But those weren't 2,000 really meaningful, actionable, emails where someone then read it and took a next step. And I think mass marketing, I think it died in the somewhere in the 90s, when DVR came around, you were able to fast forward through commercials. But even before that, like I feel like people would channel swap when the commercial came on and then channel swap back. Um, and in today, I feel like people are more likely to make a purchase based on their opinions of their peers. It's why Yelp and Reddit are so popular. We know we can't believe advertising. We know companies are trying to sell us their product to get our money. I don't know if people remember the old Sprite ads with Kobe and Shaq that basically made fun of this, but you know, I'm not saying there isn't a place for mass marketing. There is a great place for mass marketing, but what I think is there's an even more important place, that we need to be building to empower and provide for peers to have conversations with their peers, for people like Desiree, who was a staff member, to go out and share her story, or people who have gotten an email and go, well, I can't read this with my text to speech reader. I use that often. You know, I might not identify as a person with disability, but I can tell this is inaccessible. I should go and I should talk to people about here's how I do my work. Um, these are those things. Okay, I'm gonna end with some random thoughts. Again, these are just random stories, because this is all about storytelling, and how I think you should be handling this. Um, the first is a story from this book called Extreme Ownership. There's this Navy SEAL, Wilko Jakowitz. Um, Jaco Japowitz, I think his name is. And he talks about during going through Navy SEAL training, there's this one leadership exercise where you basically have this like plastic raft, and you're divided into six teams, and you go on this obstacle course. And the team that comes in first place, that's called boat one, and the team that comes in last place is called boat six, right? And he pulls the captain of boat six, and he goes, "Oh, why did you come in last place? Like, what is it that you did that you think you failed in this exercise?" And in this story, he recounts that the captain of that boat was like, my men weren't strong enough, right? It was clear that, they were the least strong. They couldn't do the obstacles, and he kind of put it all on his team. And so the commander goes, okay, well, let's switch the commander of boat six and boat one, and let's rerun the obstacle course. And so they rerun it, and boat six, now under the new leadership, came in second place, shortly behind first place. And so he pulls all the captains. He goes, okay, well, what did you do differently than the last guy, right? Like, you came in first place in the first run, and you took the last place team and you got them almost the first place, seconds behind, making second place. What did you do? And the answer was, well, this was the second time we were doing this. I know everyone was tired. I wasn't trying to make it to the end. I told my team we're gonna have the best time possible. All we're going to do is make it to that first benchmark. And however we do that, we want to make sure this is our personal best, getting to that benchmark. And when we got to the benchmark, we said, you know what? It doesn't matter how we end this. We're gonna have our personal best getting to the second benchmark. And he kept going each benchmark until the end. And the point of this story is when you look at the inaccessibility of your university, your company, whatever it is, there is a lot of work to do. And if you look at just the total picture, it's going to look like you're not making progress. And I think this more important than anything for people is that you're breaking this up into smaller pieces and you're just looking at that first benchmark. And you're not so much like we talked before, don't give everyone everything all at once is going to overwhelm them. this too is a recipe of people getting burnt out, people getting discouraged, people going, well, I'm not making progress. There's still 2 million inaccessible PDFs out there, and every day there's more inaccessible PDFs. And even in our field, I think sometimes we can feel that way, where we're constantly digging a hole that keeps getting refilled and we're not making progress. And that's because we keep looking at that end goal, whereas we really need to start breaking this up and only looking at that one benchmark. Here at Rutgers, we know that PDFs are a nightmare to fix. It's going to require training. And we're not even at the point that we're having faculty remediate their PDFs. We're at the point where we're saying all we want you to do is run, tidy up, and clean up your courses. Let's get rid of all the junk. Let's get rid of all the things you're not even using. Because that in and of itself is going to make your course a whole lot more accessible than it was before. The second thing, the story about trains. So train stations used to have a problem where they were getting a lot of complaints that trains weren't moving fast enough, right? And so the train industry, they had a big meeting and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, these engineers are there and they're going, well, we're working as fast as we can. The trains are operating as fast as it can go. Any faster is a safety issue. We need to figure out how infrastructurally we're going to rebuild this whole massive, train, infrastructure. And they had this guy who's a social psychologist. He came in and he was like, well, you don't really have to make the trains faster. And they all kind of looked at him and goes, what do you mean? And he goes, well, the issue is, they're sitting there and the experience of them waiting there is, there's all this uncertainty of when the train is going to come. And so what they did was they introduced this monitor that basically said the train's going to come in 4 minutes, the train's going to come in 3 minutes, and the train's going to come in 1 minute, right? And it was that that indicator that progress was happening that eased a lot of people. And I think leadership is the same way, where they want to get to that end result, right? And they're going, well, this isn't happening fast enough. We have a year, you know, but really this is about consistency over time. And not only do we have to make sure that we're coming up with a plan to get there over time, we also have to consider the experience of people within that system, right? We also have to be able to show that, okay, well, here's our first benchmark, and we're going to provide you updates to let you know, like, okay, well, here's the progress that we're making over time, because that's going to go a long way towards showing, like, okay, we are working towards this goal. This isn't just, I'm fighting the good fight, and one day we will get to the end, but we can really demonstrate that we're making this consistency over time. And the last, and this story comes from there's this show, Silicon Valley, and she probably saw clips on the internet about this. But there's this clip where he's being interviewed, and they talk about the rise of the industrial age in London, and at the time, the primary means of travel was horse-drawn carriages. But the problem with horses is, they leave, their excrements around because they're animals. And so the city was running into a problem with, how do I deal with all these excrements, everywhere? And then, what happened was the automobile was invented in the United States. And that innovation kind of solved that problem in this adjacent area. And I mentioned this because it feels like AI is this big innovation that we think is going to solve our problems in our other areas. And AI has gotten so good that, we've seen it be able to create some really great image descriptions. We've seen it be able to take a PowerPoint and mass bulk, remediate, quote unquote, near quotes, PDFs. We've seen the auto captions and videos become so much better than the way they were 10 years ago. And, you know, I don't want to discredit, the rise of innovation, because it is really helping. But I think I want to leave people with a warning about it. And I think it goes on both sides. So we have us as people who are trying to remediate and create accessible content, finding this innovation helpful. And on the flip side, think about money, right? We used to have apps like the KNFB app, which was like $100 at the time. And now it's built into your iPhone where you can point your iPhone to a currency and say, this is a $10 bill. And the more people that use these things, the more they go, well, the conversation around that dollar bill, that the US currency not being accessible starts to not happen, right? Because we think technology has solved our problem. But in reality, there's still a lot of places that only accept cash. There's still a lot of people who don't have access to that technology. And so we still need to be having the conversations about the fact that, like, there is no way to tactically feel or, the difference between $1 bill and a $10 bill, right? These conversations, they still need to happen. And there's a lot of things within our space that need to be manually checked. There's a lot of things that, it doesn't matter how great AI gets, we still need to make sure that this alt text is meeting not just the standard that is there, but also that is usable for that end user based on the context, right? And so I just want to leave the just with I think we should be cautiously optimistic about the rise of AI, but just understand, and I think it could be a tool in our toolbox, but it will never be a panacea for, like, you know, fixing the issue of accessibility. Because at the end of the day, the world should be accessible. We shouldn't need all these interfaces in between the world to make it accessible. And so that's really what I want to leave on. Um, because it feels like a lot of what we hear is, I wish there was a tool that we can just press a button and bulk fix this. And it feels like AI is progressing at such rapid pace that a lot of universities are looking into it without really understanding, the cost and really understanding what it is that they're looking at. Um, that's all I have. All those videos we'll send out. Um, um, attended with higher focus. I was glad I joined to hear the panel's voice and opinions and your stories more. Thank you. What I was thinking in this chat. Thank you, Deborah, for that. So all those video clips we'll send out with this presentation, so you have it and you can use it, at your own institutions. We have a Spotify podcast called Uncaptioned Conversations, and there we just have the audio. I don't know how much longer we're gonna do it. It is a lot of work to keep up and maintain. But like, we have a lot of really great videos and a lot of really great just audio and content there. And it spans, multiple different disciplines, right? We talk about leadership. We talk about how do we get people to come to your events. We talk about, you know, um, website accessibility and WCAG 3.0. We talk about a lot of different subjects with the thought that, you may have the serendipitous moment where there might be just one thing within an episode that makes you think and have a conversation, with your peers about that thing. So definitely go check it out. But that's all. Thank you guys for watching. We have 3 more minutes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There wasn't really content for questions, but if there are questions, I'm happy to stick around for the next couple minutes to answer. Um, Thank you again to ATAC and all those for inviting me. Um,
I am Jason. This is Jesse. I'm looking at the chat right now, and there doesn't seem to be additional questions. But yes, we can stay on here for a minute or two longer to see if there are any questions. And I will keep the recording on for another minute or so in case there are, so that those questions get recorded.
all right. Thank you guys for joining.
But so far, I just see a lot of thank yous and compliments.
Oh, well, thank you guys.
Alrighty, well, Jason, we do thank you for your time.
Thank
And
you.
this was really super informative and kind of lays out the basis of why accessibility, not kind of, but it does lay out the basis of why accessibility is so important. So it's much appreciated.
All right. Well,
Appreciated.
thank you. Um, All right, so I guess I'll go now. But thank you.
I'm just
And
gonna
then
turn off the recording and yeah, you can head on
uh,
out.